The anime begins with our protagonist, Izumi Masamune, who started living with his little sister, Sagiri, a year ago. However, since the day they met, he hasn't seen her because she locked herself in her room, and now he's doing everything he can to get her to come out. Masamune works as a light novel author while also attending high school, having started writing novels back in middle school. Around that time, he began working with Eromanga-sensei, who is responsible for his illustrations. However, Eromanga-sensei just recently started gaining public attention with their first photoshoot, which makes Masamune worried about being recognized at school or something similar. Although the only criticism he gets is that people complain about his terrible signature. To make matters worse, Eromanga-sensei constantly criticizes him on their blog for his fast-paced work schedule. Masamune finds out that Eromanga-sensei is doing a live stream that very day, so he rushes home to watch it. Before that, he brings food to his sister, as he continues to take care of her needs despite her seclusion. During the stream, he realizes that Eromanga-sensei is actually his sister, as the stream shows the plate he just left for her. She also forgets to turn off the camera, putting her in danger, so he rushes to her room to warn her. For the first time, Sagiri opens the door and tries to deny everything, as she doesn't like being identified as Eromanga-sensei. Masamune reassures her that there's nothing to be embarrassed about because her work is really good, and he even admits that he likes her erotic drawings, but this only makes things worse, as Sagiri is upset that people only associate her with that. The next day, Izumi goes to the publishing house to deliver all his ideas for new story arcs, along with scripts for manga adaptations. His editor, Ayam, wonders why he's so dedicated to his work. Izumi explains that, at first, it was out of love for the craft, but now he just wants to make money, which Ayam still considers a noble cause. Just then, an illustration from Eromanga-sensei arrives, making Izumi happy, so he rushes home to talk to Sagiri, as it was the perfect moment to tell her that he is Izumi-sensei, the person she's been working with all this time. Sagiri is shocked when she hears this and invites him into her room to talk, but she's too shy about her personal space, so she puts on a microphone so he can hear her well and scolds him for calling her drawings erotic. Nevertheless, all her drawings are like that, so she decides to criticize him instead of defending herself and attacks him for his obsession with work. She points out that even during the summer, he spends all his time locked up writing, sometimes neglecting her to the point where she has to endure hunger despite stomping on the floor to get him to feed her. Izumi brushes it off as something that happens, but what surprises him most is that she does so much more than just draw, like managing her blog and streams. Sagiri then shares that it all started when her mother taught her how to draw because, after her mother passed away, it was the only thing she had left of her. Seeing people stream and have fun sharing their passion made her realize that it was what she wanted to do, which makes Izumi happy because he felt the same way. However, Sagiri wonders why he cares so much about her if she's such a bothersome sister. Izumi believes that just being family and living under the same roof is reason enough, but Sagiri feels uncomfortable because, to her, living in the same house doesn't automatically make them family. Even so, Izumi has no intention of leaving her, so he thanks her for the illustration and leaves her alone. The next day, a classmate of Sagiri's named Megumi rings the doorbell, but when she sees that the protagonist doesn't fall in love with her right away, she starts to doubt his sexuality. Luckily, the protagonist was well-trained after washing Sagiri's underwear for a whole year, so he doesn't get nervous easily anymore. However, Megumi takes it a step further by saying that she likes cucumbers, so the protagonist quickly changes the subject before the conversation gets any weirder. Megumi explains that she wanted to convince Sagiri to go to school, so she asks the protagonist to call Sagiri so she can talk to her. However, Sagiri refuses to talk to Megumi and gets upset just because he let her in, as now she has to figure out a way to get rid of her without coming downstairs. She stays on a call with the protagonist while he talks to Megumi. Megumi gets mad at Izumi for not getting Sagiri to come down, as she doesn't understand how he can be okay with her staying locked in her room. When she realizes that Izumi also wants Sagiri to come out, she offers an alliance to support their common goal. The protagonist, however, doesn't understand why Megumi wants to get Sagiri out of her room so badly, so Megumi explains that her goal is to be friends with everyone, and she needs Sagiri to come out of her room to achieve that. But this type of person is the kind Sagiri dislikes, so hearing this doesn't help much. Nevertheless, Megumi has a great idea to get Sagiri out cutting off the internet, but this is too drastic, so the protagonist refuses, as the internet isn't just for wasting time. Though Megumi doesn't see its value because she believes having real-life friends to talk to is much better. Upon hearing this, Sagiri yells that it's not true, nearly bursting the protagonist's eardrum, which makes Megumi realize they were on a call. She then takes the opportunity to provoke Izumi, but her true intention was to keep him from hanging up and to transfer the call to her phone so the protagonist could speak freely without holding back, knowing he was being overheard. Now that the groundwork has been laid, she asks what he thinks of Sagiri. The protagonist speaks highly of her despite the fact that she never leaves her room. This leads Megumi to speculate that they might be involved in an illicit relationship between siblings, especially since they're not related by blood. However, to the protagonist, Sagiri is still his sister, so that's impossible. Despite all her flaws, he knows that many people value her, and he's proud of her. Megumi decides to give up for now, but makes it clear that she'll be back at any moment. Sagiri gets angry when she hears that the protagonist isn't from Alabama, so she ignores him for the rest of the day. To make matters worse, the protagonist receives a call from Ayam, who tells him that all his ideas are garbage, so he starts writing something that might be useful. The next day, he goes to the bookstore where his friend Tomo works and checks to see if his book is selling. He's surprised to find that none have been sold yet, so he tries to move them to the front where people can see them. However, Tomo doesn't allow it, explaining that spot is reserved for the bestseller, which is Yamada's book. Tomo advises him to write a story that sells well so he can have his book placed in the front, and the protagonist has no choice but to agree, especially since he also enjoys those novels. Later, he stops by the publishing house and sees Ayam arguing with a young blonde woman who won't stop complaining. To his surprise, it's Elf Yamada, and not only that, but she also wants Eromanga-sensei to do her illustrations. Izumi panics, knowing that the power of sales can convince anyone, so he knows exactly what he has to do. Incredibly, instead of focusing on writing better stories, he goes to Sagiri and begs her never to leave him, which leaves her confused. However, she takes the opportunity to tell him that from now on, she'll wash his clothes early, leaving the protagonist speechless since he had only mentioned that when he was with Megumi, and she wasn't supposed to be listening. The next day, Megumi arrives at the protagonist's house with her entire class to ask Sagiri to come out, but this only makes her retreat further, so he steps out to tell her to stop. Megumi listens and hands him a notice from the neighborhood, though he wonders why they didn't give it to him directly. Izumi thinks it's because of the rumors about ghosts in the neighboring house, where a famous writer had died years ago. They say you can sometimes hear a piano playing even though the house is abandoned. Just then, Megumi sees someone pass by. The protagonist thinks she's joking, so they leave it at that. However, Sagiri had also heard a piano coming from that house, so she sends the protagonist to check if there's a ghost. He peeks through the window and realizes it's Elf Yamada who's naked. Because of this, he rings the doorbell to ask what she's doing there. Elf explains that she moved to Tokyo to be closer to the publishers and book signing events, wanting to flaunt her wealth. She lets him into the house, but the protagonist is offended by the ghost rumors. Elf doesn't seem bothered by them. In fact, she says it would give her more material to write about in the worst-case scenario. Izumi tells her she shouldn't be naked, even if it's in her own home, but Elf gets angry at this advice, insisting that nudity is art. Not only does it inspire her, but it's also what most attracts her fans, which is why she includes it in all her works. The protagonist agrees with her to some extent, but sometimes he feels she goes too far. However, Elf doesn't want to hear advice from someone who sells so little. The protagonist argues that sales aren't everything, and to prove it, he bets on Eromanga-sensei's work. Elf accepts the challenge, and they both agree to create a manuscript, with the one Eromanga-sensei chooses as the best winning her illustrations. Izumi rushes to tell Sagiri about the bet, but Elf interrupts them because she didn't like that he left so suddenly without saying goodbye. They start arguing, which only angers Sagiri, and she ends up kicking him out of her room when she finds out he saw their neighbor naked. The next day, Elf waits for the protagonist after he gets home from school because she wanted to show him the studio where she works, something she hadn't done the day before. She realizes that the protagonist is a fan of hers because of how excited he gets when receiving an autographed copy, which makes her happy. She's also thrilled because soon she'll discover Eromanga-sensei's identity and be able to give them the work she loves so much. Izumi is shocked to hear this, unsure of how she plans to do it, and he's especially scared since she's standing right in front of him. Elf then reveals everything she's figured out, and it's pretty accurate. Elf wonders what the protagonist sees through the window so often and notices Sagiri drawing, which surprises her because Sagiri looks genuinely happy doing it. This, according to Elf, is how the best art is created. The protagonist is pleased to hear his sister's hard work being praised, so he promises to deliver Elf's manuscript to Eromanga-sensei so she can read it and, in return, stop investigating. Before she leaves, Elf asks why he's her fan. The protagonist tells her that her stories saved him during difficult times in his life because they're funny and sad at the same time. Elf responds by saying that she's saved many people, but that he must have saved a few himself, which makes the protagonist start to respect her a bit more as a writer. Weeks later, he snaps out of it because when he sees Elf working, he realizes she wasn't doing anything under the excuse of lacking inspiration. This is completely opposite to his way of working, as he always writes down whatever comes to mind, which is why his work is constantly rejected. Elf is outraged and tells him to come back the next day because she's going to teach him how to write. Izumi goes as she asks, but all he does is cook for her. She explains that the way she gathers inspiration is by experiencing how her characters feel, and at that moment, she now knows how a maid feels when she wants to cook something delicious for her master. Izumi realizes what he needs to do to create his masterpiece, so he rushes to Sagiri to tell her what he plans to write. However, she's angry because, despite him saying he's not friends with their neighbor, he goes to her house often, which makes him seem like a bad brother. Izumi tells her he'll prove that's not true by using her as inspiration to write a story about siblings, but this doesn't excite Sagiri. In fact, it does the opposite, as it grosses her out and she kicks him out. Nonetheless, the protagonist gives it his all to have his work ready by the agreed-upon day. He meets up with Elf to compare their stories, and for the first time, he sees her working seriously, as she hadn't written a single word until the day before. They start comparing their stories, and the protagonist realizes that Elf's story is really good, making it quite challenging for him. However, Elf twists in frustration as she reads the protagonist's story, feeling it's unfair to compete against it. Izumi thinks it's because his story is too good, but Elf deflates him by saying it won't sell. She explains that it's unfair because that story is only a masterpiece to him and his sister, Eromanga-sensei. The protagonist is shocked to hear that she figured out his sister is Eromanga, but it's because of his manuscript, which is practically a confession of how his life is with his sister. Elf concedes that it's impossible for her to win against that, but she also tells him she hasn't given up and will definitely beat him next time to get Eromanga-sensei's illustrations. The protagonist then jumps into Sagiri's room from Elf's balcony since Sagiri hasn't shown any signs of life since he told her about his plan to write his masterpiece, and he's desperate for her to read his manuscript. Sagiri gets angry at him for doing something so dangerous, but she shows him everything she's been working on for the last 15 days. Izumi is surprised to see that, for the first time, she has drawn weapons in her illustrations, something she wasn't good at because it made her too sad to imagine someone dying. But because her brother had been going to the neighbor's house, she thought he was working with another illustrator and would replace her at any moment, so she started practicing to improve her drawings, including weapons and well-endowed women, which she knew he liked so much. The protagonist clarifies that he is actually just a writer, and that they were competing to see who could write the work she liked the most. Sagiri feels relieved and angry at the same time, saying that she would always choose her brother regardless of how many sales the competition has. The protagonist is happy to hear this, but now feels embarrassed for her to read his manuscript. However, Sagiri doesn't mind and wants to see what he's written. In the end, she really likes it but forbids him from publishing it. Now that they've resolved everything that was bothering her, Sagiri takes the opportunity to confess that she likes someone, which surprises the protagonist. But it's something that had to happen sooner or later, so she tells him her dream is to revise the novel to make it a bestseller. She has an anime and more to get rich from the story and illustrations of her sister. Sagiri gets excited upon hearing this, and she decides to move forward to achieve that dream alongside him. To do so, she gathers the courage to leave her room for the first time in a long while. The next day, the protagonist keeps thinking about the boy Sagiri likes, so he tells her that he fell in love with her at first sight when she came to his house. He means he likes her in secret but will make an effort to become an exemplary older brother since he doesn't want to cause her any problems with the boy she likes. This makes her very angry because the protagonist didn't understand her confession at all. A few days later, Izumi asks Sagiri for help with a novel project, and it turns out that to publish the new novel he wants to release, he needs to submit a project and wants her to illustrate a new character. Sagiri agrees and draws the first thing that comes to mind. Meanwhile, the protagonist receives many distress messages from Elf but ignores them because he is now focused on observing Sagiri's work. He judges his sister's talent as she creates it, although the image he has of his protagonist is much more like a child, just like his sister. For obvious reasons, this makes her nervous, but Elf starts tapping on the balcony windows a lot. The protagonist goes to see what's happening, and she jumps into his arms to escape from the security of her publisher. It turns out they were sent to force her to work, which is normal, but for her, it was the end of the world. Taking advantage of her being at his house, she asks the protagonist to see Eromanga-sensei, and he agrees, but only via video call. To Elf's surprise, the questions she asks are more perverted than those of a little sister, though considering her pseudonym, it's more understandable. So, she decides to do something they both like: play video games. Izumi goes to get food while she has fun, but upon returning, he sees Elf showing her underwear to Sagiri in exchange for an illustration. He calls security to have her removed, and he's happy to see that his sister was finally able to get along with someone other than him, as they had coincidentally become friends. Later, the protagonist returns to work and his editor informs him that if he submits a decent project, it could be published immediately. Sagiri finishes an illustration with all the motivation she gained that day, so the protagonist finds the perfect lead character. However, they now have a new problem. Sagiri has lost all inspiration to draw well-endowed women and now needs to recharge it with examples. He assigns the protagonist the task of finding someone with a lot of endowment who is willing to show her their bust. This is a very difficult task, but he agrees to do his best, and later he receives a call from Megumi to discuss new plans to get Sagiri out of her room. They agree to meet at the bookstore. Izumi arrives first and takes the opportunity to look for inspiration. Tomo offers to be a model since she meets all the requirements, but she retracts in the end when she hears that she has to show her underwear to Sagiri. Just then, Megumi arrives and says she discovered that he's a novel writer because his name was on the calendar at his house. She found a way to become friends with Sagiri by starting to read manga, though she says it in such a derogatory way that both the protagonist and Tomo can't help but be offended. Tomo gets very upset, and upon hearing that Megumi wants to start reading novels, she recommends the top-ranking one to turn her into an addict. The next day, Megumi calls the protagonist, asking when the next installments will be released, as she feels a void from not knowing what happens next. The protagonist recommends she read new novels and even suggests using it as an excuse to get closer to Sagiri, since they now have a common interest. Megumi is pleased to hear this, but wonders if she will really be welcomed as easily as the protagonist says. She asks Sagiri, and incredibly, Sagiri agrees, though with a small condition: Megumi must allow Sagiri to use her as inspiration for her characters. Megumi thought it would be easy since modeling is something she can do without problems, but in order for Sagiri to let her into her room, Sagiri ties her hands and blindfolds her. Only then does Sagiri let her in and starts to enjoy the view through her eyes, as seeing someone so defenseless excites her. The protagonist tries to calm Megumi, questioning her supposed experience with love and men, as if it were true, she should be able to handle being seen in her underwear without issues. However, Sagiri gets too motivated and removes everything to gain inspiration, causing Megumi to start crying since this was not in the contract. Even Sagiri feels bad for what she did, so she removes the blindfold, apologizes sincerely, gives her the promised favorite novels, and as an additional apology, promises to give her more when she finishes. Upon arriving at the publisher's office, they encounter a distracted girl, and Elf starts to belittle her because she thinks the girl is a novice writer. However, the young woman remains silent and continues on her way, as she also came to speak with Iam. She informs them that the position is not guaranteed for anyone yet, as there will be a competition for this publishing slot, and Iam is willing to let him participate. The young woman feels sorry for him because she never let him win, so she signs up for the contest. Izumi is shocked to discover that she is Muramasa Senju. Muramasa acts arrogantly and advises him to give up, which angers Elf. However, Muramasa uses the same reasoning and provides her sales figures, which amount to over 14 million, 7 times more than hers. Elf has no choice but to remain silent and endure. Nevertheless, the protagonist does not want to give up on his dream, so he challenges her to a competition to see who wins. If she wins, he will grant her any request, but if he wins, she has to stop interfering, like when she took over his publishing slot and now signing up for the contest just to prevent him from winning. They return home, and the protagonist apologizes to Sagiri for making such an impulsive decision, as he had risked everything out of anger. However, for Sagiri, it's normal because Muramasa tried to interfere with her dream, and that cannot be allowed, so they will just have to defeat her. He is relieved to hear that she agrees, but wants to know how she plans to defeat Muramasa. The protagonist tells her that he plans to adapt the novel he wrote about his sister into the short format required for the contest. Elf agrees, as that is the only work with the potential to defeat someone as strong as Muramasa. However, the protagonist doesn't know how to create short formats, so he begins a period of intensive training to adapt the work without losing quality. After much effort, sweat, and tears, the protagonist manages to produce decent short format work, but Muramasa shows up at his house dressed as a schoolgirl, as I.M. suggested that this is how she best stimulates men. The protagonist is left confused, so Muramasa tells him that she wants to ask him again to give up and start writing privately for her. This doesn't clarify anything for him, but Elf begins to understand what's going on, so she stops Muramasa before she says more and lets her in to talk. At the table, Muramasa starts writing, and the protagonist thinks she's working on a continuation of her novels. However, she doesn't even remember the names of her stories because she writes for herself, not for others, as she enjoys reading a lot. She only became a writer so she could write a lot without her family criticizing her, and she's unable to read other people's stories because she can't find works she likes, except for one. But her own work ended up this way because she is now trying to create works she considers masterpieces, not just very good works. Setting this aside, Muramasa wants to know why the protagonist changed genres if he was doing well with his fighting novels, as that was the real reason she entered the contest and kept getting in his way. Aquí tienes la traducción al inglés de Estados Unidos. Izumi doesn't understand, so Elf tells him that someone as clueless as the protagonist needs her to be direct. Muramasa confesses that her inspiration for writing books was the protagonist's works, and her favorite was his bestseller. However, when he changed genres, she lost all motivation to continue writing battle stories because she thought she had lost her inspiration. Because of this, she wanted him to abandon his dream and continue writing for her, which would solve her problems. But Sagiri steps out to refuse, stating clearly that she won't give her brother up to anyone. With such a clear response, the protagonist also refuses and asks her to calm down since his next work couldn't disappoint his fans. Muramasa leaves and warns that she hopes it will be the case. After all the emotions he's experienced, the protagonist gets motivated and delivers the best possible result. He eagerly awaits the outcome, and Elf teases him a bit, as she has many reasons to do so. Muramasa confessed her feelings through her story, and the protagonist had to reject her directly because he already has someone else in his heart. Upon seeing the results, he is pleased to find that he lost by a very narrow margin in the votes. However, Muramasa's work was disqualified due to its size, which allowed the protagonist to keep his dream alive. The next day, Sagiri puts on a yukata even though she had no plans to leave the house. The protagonist tells her she looks cute but accidentally mentions that she resembles Muramasa, which annoys her because she was the one who confessed her feelings to him, and to make matters worse, she doesn't have any problem admitting that she likes him. The protagonist calms her down by saying that he had already rejected Muramasa because he likes someone else, and that person is her. Despite her rejection, his feelings haven't changed, which only makes Sagiri more nervous. Finally, the deadline for submitting the new release arrives, so Izumi goes to the publisher to work there until it's finished, leaving Sagiri alone at home. She secures the house to make it look like no one is inside and starts enjoying herself by watching TV and eating. Meanwhile, the protagonist spends all his time writing and writing until he starts to get tired. He calls Sagiri to chat, but since he doesn't have much to say, he only asks her not to stay up too late. After finishing his work, Elf goes to see him because he hasn't been answering lately. She had arranged to have a party at the protagonist's house, as he will have a slot thanks to the novel contest. It turns out that there were several interesting works, so they decided to publish the top 3, meaning Muramasa will also be invited. Izumi gets nervous hearing this since he doesn't know what to say to someone he had rejected. Elf gets upset because she believes the best way to fix things is by spending time together. Izumi only agrees because she tells him to, which is very unusual, but it's because the protagonist starts seeing her as an older sister, although Elf doesn't like having a brother like him. Because of this, Elf calls Muramasa to invite her to the party, and she accepts without any problems, which surprises the protagonist. However, Muramasa still feels the same about him despite being rejected, so she still wants to see him, surprising the protagonist because they are more alike than he expected. The first to arrive is Shido, who is a bit serious, but when the young women arrive, the atmosphere loosens up considerably as Elf and Muramasa start arguing over the protagonist, leaving Shido surprised at how popular he is. This angers Sagiri quite a bit, and she asks if it's true, since supposedly he has someone he likes. The protagonist publicly apologizes for not respecting that. Shido feels quite embarrassed upon seeing the relationship he had with Eromanga-sensei, as he was supposed to be a man. However, Elf doesn't clarify the confusion because it's better to think that way than to reveal the truth. They then start talking about their dreams as mangakas, with Shido having the usual dream and Elf having an unusual one: she wants to conquer the world. The protagonist, on the other hand, has a sweet dream of making a novel that can be adapted into an anime so he can watch it with his sister. Eromanga-sensei, for her part, shares the same dream as the protagonist, but she also wants to marry the person she likes. After the party ends, the protagonist feels a bit lonely seeing that no one is left in the house. Sagiri asks if he has been feeling lonely lately, and he confirms it, saying he has felt that way since his biological mother passed away. Sagiri apologizes for being locked away all day, but makes it clear that she will always be by his side. For now, she will pretend to be his sister so he doesn't have to feel that way again. Going back to the past, Elf proposed that everyone go to an event to collect data outdoors, specifically at the beach, so they could see 3D girls in swimsuits. To the protagonist's surprise, Sagiri doesn't oppose him going with the girls, as she will be working on illustrations for the novel in the meantime. Elf had already talked to her about it, so the protagonist decides to go. As a result, everyone heads to the island that inspired Elf's works, where they meet her brother, Chris, who is also her editor. He is quite serious with Elf, as he only agreed to let them come to the island to collect data and not to play around. Upon arriving at Elf's residence, they are amazed by how incredible it is. Shido then asks for a separate room for the protagonist because he still believes the protagonist is interested in Eromanga-sensei due to the misunderstanding. Later, Elf takes advantage of their time at the beach to get closer to the protagonist, as Muramasa is delayed because of the swimsuit she's wearing. The first thing she asks him is to apply sunscreen on her, but the protagonist gets nervous because Elf is an exhibitionist, and to make matters worse, Chris sees them from a distance, which only heightens the protagonist's anxiety. Fortunately, Chris leaves them alone, so Elf can do whatever she wants with the protagonist until Muramasa arrives, more embarrassed than ever, and prevents Elf from continuing her antics. They go out for a drink, and Muramasa confesses to the protagonist that she came with the intention of reading his stories. He agrees to show her some stories that are true to his style, promising that she will really enjoy them because they are the type of stories that lose quality when commercialized. She is pleased and loosens up a bit, having fun until evening, when it's time for a bath. Chris is waiting for the protagonist, as he wants to ask him to marry Elf. Izumi is surprised by this sudden proposal, and Chris asks him to consider it because he is a good match and has many talents that he learned at home to be a good wife, though he admits that he is a bit clumsy in other areas. However, the protagonist and Elf don't have that kind of relationship, as he already has someone in his heart, and if that weren't the case, he probably would have fallen for Elf a long time ago. Chris apologizes for jumping to conclusions. That night, everyone enjoyed Elf's homemade food, and the protagonist chatted with Sagiri for a while. Before going to bed, Elf goes to the protagonist's room to ask him to accompany her to see something she wanted to show him. It was the place where her father proposed to her mother. It was a beautiful spot, although it wasn't the most ideal place for her parents' proposal, as her mother hated insects, and her father had to work hard to get her to accept his proposal. The protagonist relates to this because he would also go to great lengths for someone he likes, and Elf feels the same way. This is why she left her home. Before her father passed away, he entrusted her future to her mother and trained her in domestic duties to help find a husband and secure her future. But Elf refused, wanting to fall in love and enjoy her life like her parents did, so her mother eventually accepted her wishes. Now she had found a potential husband in the protagonist, believing he would make her happy. However, she doesn't plan to propose to him. Instead, she will do everything she can to make him fall deeply in love with her, and in the end, he will be the one to propose. When that moment comes, she will reveal her true name, Emily. When Izumi returns, he stays up late writing novels as he promised Muramasa. She is thrilled because she has been wanting to read this type of non-commercial work written by the protagonist for a long time. Meanwhile, Elf tries to gain an advantage again with her culinary skills, planning to go to the beach once more to complete her list of things she wanted to do to win him over. However, her brother intervenes, believing it's time for her to work. He takes her to the living room and supervises her to ensure she doesn't get distracted. While everyone is writing, Muramasa reads the protagonist's works, and Shido gets excited just watching her read because she looks so happy. Elf tries to set up a meeting between Shido and Muramasa, but everyone knows that she already has someone she likes. She is surprised to see that everyone has noticed, and upon realizing that it became obvious after reading her novel, she goes into shock as it means even her fans know. Now that everyone is aware, Muramasa decides to stop hiding it and seize any opportunity to be close to him. Elf is left feeling awkward for talking to herself. She can't believe it might be true, but Muramasa's reaction says it all, leaving her disgusted and Muramasa defeated once again. Chris scolds everyone for wasting time, so they all return to work. However, he has to take care of some things for at least an hour, leaving them alone. As soon as he stops watching them, Elf encourages everyone to take a short break and play a quick game. They start playing a few rounds of King Says, and to convince Muramasa, Elf says she can kiss the protagonist if the king says so, which Muramasa immediately agrees to. Unfortunately for her, Elf mistakenly makes her kiss the protagonist along with Shido, causing Shido to quit the game. To fill his spot, they call Sagiri to join in as well. Since she was online, they leave the role of the king to her alone, and she begins asking the girls for perverted things. Elf has to remove her clothes, but luckily, she was prepared with a swimsuit. She asks Muramasa about her underwear, and unfortunately, she wasn't prepared at all, so her life is at risk because she is not wearing anything underneath her yukata. Chris arrives and sees them goofing off, so he asks them to write a bit. However, Muramasa is already considering quitting writing. Everyone is surprised by this news and asks her why. She explains that she has already fulfilled her dream of creating works she truly loves, so it doesn't make sense to continue writing. Because of this, Elf doesn't give her even a day to reconsider writing again. The protagonist, on the other hand, asks to speak with Muramasa alone because he has something to tell her. Izumi shows her a letter from a fan who has been writing to him since he stopped working professionally, and now he knows it's Muramasa. He is very grateful because those letters kept his motivation up even during very difficult times for him, and now that he has met one of his fans, he has fulfilled a dream he had since his debut. Muramasa is confused because her dream was to create an anime, but the protagonist doesn't see why she can't have more than one dream, or, even if she achieves her anime dream, she would never stop writing out of love for her fans. Hearing the protagonist's story makes Muramasa reconsider her decision, and she decides to pursue Izumi because being with him is also one of her dreams. Days pass and the protagonist arrives home. After settling in, he tells Sagiri that they will be having a book exhibition the next day. Both prepare to go, although Sagiri will be joining him via her laptop as always. On the way, he wonders why he started writing, and the protagonist explains that after his mother died, his father wanted to see him happy, because that would make the whole family happy. So he sought a hobby and came across novels online. He started publishing and realized that it was something he enjoyed doing. During that time, Sagiri stopped going to school because her parents had divorced, and then returned for a particular reason, but that's a secret. It turns out she started talking to the protagonist online without knowing who he was because she had read his first novel. He remembers that first novel with a bit of embarrassment because, thanks to a fan, Sagiri, he felt very happy as she had congratulated him for finishing it. This encouragement made him more motivated to become a professional writer because he thought he was a genius. His father laughed, but he decided to support him because it would make him very happy. He gave him a laptop for his work, as a professional writer would need a place to write his novels. With that and his encouraging fan, he was highly motivated to start his writing career. He continued talking to Sagiri without knowing she was the same person, and she made illustrations for his novels. He saw it more as a hobby and wasn't interested in learning more, even though his mother offered to teach him. Hearing his story of overcoming challenges, she decided that staying locked up in her room wasn't a good idea. She got motivated to return to school. Meanwhile, the protagonist quickly became a true professional, so she decided to stop drawing for him and focus on improving her technique, planning to come back when she could create professional illustrations and work alongside him. She knew this would require a lot of time and effort, so she went to her mother to ask for help. Returning to the present, they arrive in Akihabara. After a walk, they go to see the novel exhibition, marking the fulfillment of the first step in their dream. Now, they just need to keep moving forward. Izumi was worried about whether the novel would be well received by readers. However, he meets a young fan who is the ideal audience for his book, as she loves illustrations and believes strongly in his work. This means that at least they have captured one person's interest, which is a good enough reason to keep working together. A few days later, Eromanga-sensei does a live stream to promote the new novel, and she promises to surpass herself in the next installment. She has a plan to motivate herself. Elf wanted to go camping with the protagonist, and as an offering, she and Muramasa offered to do whatever he commands. Because of this, Sagiri informs her brother that the next volume needs to be more erotic than ever. He agrees, but is actually stuck because he doesn't know many romantic scenes involving sisters, as he used to write only action novels. He asks Sagiri to let him pet her head to gather data, and she agrees for the sake of the plot. However, after a while, she becomes embarrassed and kicks him out of her room for thinking erotic thoughts about his sister. Nevertheless, the protagonist had already gathered plenty of motivation. When he comes downstairs, he finds Elf waiting for Muramasa to start the Eromanga-sensei festival. Izumi asks her if Muramasa knew about the deal, and she obviously did not, but those are just details, as everything is for the protagonist's benefit. Upon hearing this, Muramasa agrees to comply with Sagiri's requests. Sagiri then begins to materialize her fantasies, starting with two girls in bikinis playing Twister. After a while, the scene becomes quite awkward, but Tomo visits the protagonist to give him a doujinshi made of his novel. Sagiri rushes to see them because she feels jealous that someone else is coming to see her brother. However, she eventually gets distracted and only focuses on the doujinshi, as she is eager to see the characters illustrated in more mature scenes. After some struggle to get a look at the package, she starts drawing an erotic manga based on her own work. The protagonist blushes deeply because it's obvious that the manga is about the two of them, and he can't handle seeing mature scenes created by his own sister. Although it relieved her a bit, seeing that there were still several innocent mistakes, as the stick didn't look real and wasn't in the right place. Sagiri gets angry upon hearing this and asks for specifics about what's wrong, but telling her that it's the stick and what wasn't drawn correctly is too much. So she asks Elf for help, and Muramasa is appalled at what she's forcing a woman to read. The protagonist understands what Muramasa means, but has no choice, and unfortunately, Elf knows as much about the male body as Sagiri does, so she can't find the mistakes. The girls decide to verify with the only man they have access to, and Muramasa refuses to help, saying he brought it upon himself. Izumi calls for a timeout since there's someone else who should be informed, so he calls Megumi and asks her to point out what's wrong. She sends a drawing of her supposed boyfriend, but since it was depicting her elementary school brother, the girls are even more confused. Muramasa loses patience and draws a sculpture representing a man, which helps the girls understand what she means, but it makes her seem like the most perverted one in the group. The rest of the afternoon, Sagiri enjoys gathering inspiration, and by the end, the girls have fun modeling, so they say they'd like to distribute it another time. She makes an effort to say goodbye through the window because she also enjoyed spending the afternoon with them. And thus, the anime ends. And that's the end of the summary of this wonderful anime. I hope you liked it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button, as it helps and motivates me to keep creating more content for you. See you soon.